I would just like to start. Thank you. I would just like to start today by acknowledging at the outset that the Parliamentary Centre is located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people. The Algonquins are the customary keepers and defenders of the Ottawa River, watershed, and its tributaries. We honor their very long history of welcoming many nations to this beautiful territory, and we uphold and uplift the voice and values of our host nation. My name is Tom Cormier, and I have the privilege of being the President and CEO of the Parliamentary Centre, Canada's global leader for democracy. To say I'm excited about today is a bit of an understatement for those of you who know me. I am a self-professed Parliament nerd, and I'm very happy today that we have assembled on one virtual stage some of the most experienced, most talented, and most passionate parliamentary experts in North America, and I would argue the world, to discuss why parliaments matter. Why they matter to citizens, to development outcomes, to equality, to inclusion, to peace, to reconciliation, to agriculture, to economic development, to trade, to healthcare, to anti-corruption, and why they should matter to every single person who wants a better, just, more fair world. I want to acknowledge the continued support of the US Embassy for this virtual dialogue series. I want to also thank Gabrielle Bardal for her leadership, for Alexander Shaw, who is helping organize these dialogues. And I also want to thank Kristen, Tom, Derek, John, as well as Kevin and Alicia for agreeing to meet with us today and to stimulate a discussion for our audience that will help us make the case why parliaments are deserving of more attention, not only as a development goal, but to keep in mind for foreign policy considerations when Canada is looking to engage in new ways in the world, in new constructive ways. I want to first start by introducing our panelists, our moderators today. Very pleased to have Kevin DeVoe, who is an associate of the Parliamentary Centre and president of DeVoe International Governance Consultants. Kevin is a former legislator from the province of Nova Scotia, and he's worked as a parliamentary advisor everywhere. He was the UNDP's senior most expert in parliaments, providing support to more than 70 UNDP country offices. And he has worked for every major organization in the world, and we're very pleased to have him with us. We're also joined by Alicia Todd, Director General of Parlaméricas. And Parlaméricas, as Alicia will always tell us, is an institution that promotes parliamentary diplomacy in the inter-American system. It was born in Canada and continues to be housed in Canada. We're privileged to be across the hall from each other when we're looking forward to the time when we're back in the same building and can speak to each other every day. Alicia has been involved in democratic development for many years now, previously with Canada, focusing on electoral observation, but has been doing a fantastic job transforming Parlaméricas to be a leading example of the importance of parliamentary diplomacy, parliament networking, and the value of parliaments to connect with citizens they serve. So I will hand it over to our moderators to get us going. And I look forward to the discussion that ensues. Thank you for joining us. Over to you, moderators.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that kind introduction. Welcome to everyone. Happy Bastille Day if you happen to be joining us from France or a French citizen. And I'm really looking forward to this as well. I've had an opportunity to work with, I think, all of the panelists who are here today. And for those who maybe not as much of a parliament nerd as Tom and I, it's sort of a dirty little secret of the American parliamentary or legislative strengthening movement that there's a lot of Canadians who end up working for American organizations for various reasons, some that hopefully we might be able to discuss here today. But overall, I think there has been that long link between the Canadians and Americans and how we approach democracy promotion and legislative strengthening. So I think this is a great opportunity to have a bit more of a discussion, to unpack some of those things. And for us as myself and Alicia as co-moderators and Canadians, an opportunity to hear from our colleagues from the South as to exactly how they approach this work and what we can learn from that as we begin to think about legislative strengthening, parliamentary development as Canada, as a government that's thinking about increasing its efforts in this area, and of course the work of the Parliamentary Centre. So I want to welcome everyone here today. I'll hand it over to Alicia, who I think is going to do some brief introductions, and then we're going to open it up to the panelists, the four panelists, to give us a brief opening remarks, and then we're going to have a few questions for them that Alicia and I will moderate, and then after that, Gabrielle will also open it up to the floor, if I can put it that way, virtual floor, for others to participants to be able to comment as well and ask questions. So, Alicia.
Thank you, Kevin. Tom, Gabrielle, thank you for organizing this event. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. I'd really like to congratulate the Parliamentary Centre and the US Embassy for this series. For the past 15 years, I've been working in this sector, and I do get to work often with, I had the privilege of working with my American colleagues, but I personally have learned a tremendous amount about the way this work is being done from the United States over the last several sessions you've done. And so I'm really hopeful the attendees here today will likewise learn a lot about legislative strengthening, and I'm really delighted that we get to have this conversation with who we have with us here today. It is my great privilege to introduce all of our great panelists here. So we do have with us today John Johnson, who is a democracy and governance specialist from the United States. Dr. Johnson is a political scientist who has supported parliaments worldwide for more than 30 years. He has directed USAID parliamentary projects, consulted with MPs, staff, experts from more than 50 nations through McGill, the Parliamentary Centre, World Bank. I can name them all. John, I bow down to you. You have done so much in this field. And so we are very delighted to have you here. I guess currently training MPs and staff through the McGill School of Continuing Studies, which tells me that you also have this great connection with Canada as well. So that is wonderful. This is what we're about here today, is that we do have these connections. We also have with us today Derek Luyten. He's the executive director of the House Democracy Partnership, who Parliamericans loves to work with. So we're very delighted to have you here, Derek, but it's my pleasure to finally meet you. He serves as the executive director of the partnership, a bipartisan commission of the House Representatives that works to promote responsive, effective government and strengthen democratic institutions by assisting legislatures in emerging democracies. And I know Derek is going to actually give us a real good rundown exactly what HDP is. And I'll already plug it out there for people listening. I think it's a real interesting model for Canada to look at as well. As a practitioner, the value of HDP's work, I have to say, we see it throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And so we're looking forward to hearing more from Derek. Kristen Sample, a wonderful colleague from NDI. She's currently the director for governance team at NDI. Although for any of you who worked in the sector, you've probably met Kristen in many other places as well. She does come from also International IDEA. Let me see. Her career includes nearly 20 years of engagement in support of inclusive political reform in Latin America, as well as numerous publications on anti-corruption, democratic delivery, citizen security, political representation, and gender. And I'm going to say we've often contacted Kristen because she is a gender expert, and you do need to contact her if you ever have a question about gender. She is an amazing asset to have here on this panel today. And then we have Tomas Bridle, Senior Governance Advisor, currently at USAID. And Tom serves as he's at the Center of Excellence in Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance, with a focus on supporting strategic assessment and program design in post-conflict environments and during periods of political transition. I heard from Tom prior that he's just finished authoring a study on kind of legislative strengthening. So I know he's going to share with us some of his learnings from that recent study. He has had positions with NDI and DAI. And so it's a small community. We've got to meet each other in the past, although it's my first time meeting some of you. And And I know many of our attendees will have possibly had the opportunity to work with some of you, but today's dialogue, Kevin and I have prepared a series of questions. We're really looking forward to engaging in a robust discussion here today. And so we're delighted to have you. I guess then without further ado, I do get to say we would like to invite to start us off would be Dr. John Johnson. Please, would you like to give us your opening remarks?
Sure. First of all, thank you, everybody. And as Tom said, we're a lot of Parliament files here, so we're always delighted when we have an opportunity to talk about these things. I did get to work with the Parliamentary Center in the early 2000s in Africa, and so it's nice to see this as being rekindled. I got into the field because I had practical experience working in a legislature in the New York State Senate, and later I got to be a diplomat in Mexico and learned to speak Spanish, and then started working first in 1990 in Chile. So I've been part of that development of the field since then. What I want to do is do two basic things. One, give you a quick overview of how the field is developed primarily from the US point of view, and then just talk really briefly, I think, some of the particular strengths that Canada has in this. So first of all, the 30,000-foot overview. It's been one of the most amazing things that's happened in our lifetimes is the 1990s. We're going to talk about stage one of this development. The U.S. had some experience doing this kind of work around after World War II in Japan and also in Germany, helping to rebuild those democracies and working with those parliaments. But the 1990s were utterly astounding in terms of the growth of democracies which took place. The Soviet Union was no more. The Berlin Wall had fallen. In Latin America, the tradition of military governments, which had gone on for decades, was waning. And the one-party states, which had existed in Africa for so long, were also beginning to change. And we entered a moment when there were a lot of new democracies out there. And this first stage, I think, of the US assistance there, beginning around 1990, was helping those new democracies, helping those new parliaments function. And it was very much about the nuts and bolts of how to make a parliament work. And some of the early work which took place there was with the Frost Commission, the Frost Task Force, which sent people from the Congressional Research Service to 13 different states in the former Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. And it was about helping them with a lot of the nuts and bolts things to make a parliament work. It was about getting information systems working. A lot of it was about building new systems, helping basically the institution function. At the same time, or just soon after this, through USAID, the university, the State University of New York, where I worked for many years, and Florida International University began working in Latin America. And again, as the old model, the old Soviet model was declining and support from the Soviet Union around the world was declining, there was a real need for this. And my first consultants there in 1990 were actually people from the Congressional Research Service. And they were primarily there to help in building the nuts and bolts, help the new parliament, which had been closed down because of a dictatorship for 17 years, helping that to become more successful. The work of the State University that I used to be with, we moved into Bolivia, into Central America, into Africa during that same decade of the 90s. And it was a lot of that work was about making the institution function better. NDI, IRI, the Parliamentary Center, were all working during this time. Toward the end of the 1990s, UNDP also became active. That's quick stage one. Stage two, reaching beyond the walls of the parliament. This first work was important, it was useful, it helped get them started, but the realization was if you have a parliament which functions, but it doesn't do anything for the folks on the outside, for the people that it represents, then it's really not a very useful investment. So I call it reaching beyond the walls of the institution. And especially during the Clinton years in the United States, the focus of these programs spread outside more. It wasn't just about making the institution work, but it was about helping it be effective in interacting with people, with groups, with society, and becoming responsive to them as well. I lived in Kenya from 2000 to 2002 and managed a legislative strengthening project there. The main focus was on the institution, but more and more we were getting into the groups that interacted with the parliament as well. Support from the World Bank, UNDP, the UK, Scandinavian nations grew. This is when the Parliamentary Centre was active as well. And John Bosley, former Canadian speaker, John Bosley was an important part of that. He was a consultant. Again, was a small club. He used to be a consultant for me sometimes. I was a consultant for him sometimes, but I got to work with him in Africa. Stage 3 is what I'm calling, you can't change policy unless you work with the policymakers. There's been a growing realization in the development community worldwide, but it's been a real focus of USAID as well, that even as the engagement with parliaments has reduced in USAID, there's been a realization that you can't get things done unless you work with policymakers, that all development is really political in some ways. And so newer projects, even as they've kind of declined, a lot of them have been more cross-sectoral and a greater focus on thinking and working politically. One good indication of the change which has taken place over the years in the approach, in 2000, I worked on the Handbook on Legislative Strengthening. That's what it was called for USAID back then. In 2020, I got to edit what was then developing as the update of that handbook. It was called Strengthening and Working with Legislatures to Achieve Development Results. The focus wasn't just let's let these institutions be successful, let's see them change things, and that became the focus. I worked on a USAID-funded Indonesia project called ProRep from 2012 to 2015, and there it was a combination of civil society, think tanks, and the parliament working together. And as the project aged, it focused more and more on working with the offices in the USAID mission, their particular focus areas. So we focused on health policy, environmental policy, anti-corruption, and what was the other one? Education. And in it, we were bringing together the groups from society that worked on these issues with Parliament and facilitating relationships and helping them to increase their influence inside of the Parliament. So that's a real quick overview. Finally, my suggestions on what you all might be interested in doing or would be real strengths for you in Canada is, number one, work with what you got. You've got some good institutions there, the Parliamentary Centre, the program, and at McGill University, they've got a history, they've been working, they know how to do things. Kevin and I are both on the faculty of continuing education at McGill. They've trained since 2012 hundreds of parliamentarians and staff, and they've got relationships. Number two, include a focus on Commonwealth countries. Parliament is really, the Canadian Parliament is really looked up to and respected amongst Commonwealth countries, and you're all in the same club. You speak the same parliamentary language. You all have clerks. You do a lot of the same things, and there are relationships that exist in customs and traditions which exist, which are really important. Third, French is a great strength that you have compared to so many other nations. And French parliaments around the world, French-speaking parliaments around the world are greatly in need of assistance. So thank you. It's a delight to be with you and look forward to hearing the rest of this.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. I agree that the Commonwealth. So for sure, we have great success from our work with the Caribbean for that reason. Derek, I would like to invite you to join us next and give us some opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Alicia. Appreciate it. And thank you to the Parliamentary Centre for the opportunity to speak with all of you and speak about the great work that the House Democracy Partnership, or HDP, does around the world. I think it often flies under the radar in development circles, and hopefully this will help mitigate that a little bit. I'd like to pick up a little bit where Mr. Johnson mentioned the Frost-Solomon Task Force. Because the Frost-Solomon Task Force, we often consider it our predecessor. It was the organization that Congress founded in the mid-90s to really respond to the plethora of new states that were created at the fall of the Soviet Union. and to help share in the best practices of the United States Congress and governance practices in the US. When that ended, a few members came together a few years later and founded the House Democracy Partnership along the same vein to really focus on sharing the best practices. It was first called the House Democracy Assistance Commission, and that in 2005, and that name was changed in 2009 to reflect a more back and forth process to make it a little bit less paternalistic and less about what the United States can teach, but more about what we can share and more about what we can learn from others, because that is a crucial piece of the work that we do nowadays. And so who are we? We are a very unique institution within the United States Congress. We are the only body in both chambers, Senate and House, that works directly with MPs and staff in a sustained, consistent, and effective manner. We do this through bilateral and multilateral exchanges, so the peer-to-peer engagement of staff to staff and members to members. And we do that to share, again, the best practices of good governance, but also in the institution building of Parliament. And I'll explain a little bit that in a bit. Our commission, technically we are a commission, we are authorized by the Speaker's office, by the Speaker of the House. And as such, we're afforded a fair degree of autonomy and independence from other committees to conduct our programming. And really that means is that we're adaptable and we're flexible. As things change around the world, if the Gambia suddenly has a democratic opening and there's an opportunity to support it and we think that's a worthwhile investment of our resources and time, then we will go ahead and do that. And so that affords us a great opportunity to go where not necessarily the crises are, because that's not our job, because we do need a certain level of stability within Congress to do the work that HDP does. It's not the worst case scenario or anything like that. It's more about when there's an ability to share and also understand that there's a capacity to download that information, but also in part learn, and that's where HDP does its best work. So we need that flexibility, obviously, because we are a global portfolio. We work in approximately 20 countries around the world, some with more mature parliaments, more mature legislative procedures than others, and our programs thus reflect that scale of need and capacity. We are in our 16th year, as I mentioned, 2005, with the name change in 2009, and we work throughout the globe through a unique collaboration with USAID, IRI, and NDI. And I'd just like to say here, like unequivocally, the work that we do would not be feasible without IRI and NDI and the great support of USAID. The majority of this work really focuses on about 5 themes. None of this is ever driven from Washington, DC. This is driven from the field, as all programs, in my opinion, should be. The most common area where we see a lot of requests to go over are oversight of the executive, committee operations. How does a committee operate? How does it work? How is it maintained? What does an actual committee do? How's it staffed? Providing research. As John mentioned, we have an excellent CRS. Our Congressional Research Service is one of the best in the world. And a lot of other parliaments around the world would like to have that type of office, that type of ability to conduct independent, nonpartisan or bipartisan research to inform their staff and their members. Ethics is a really huge issue. Establishing, maintaining, strengthening an ethics committee or rules in Parliament is very difficult, as you may imagine, in some countries. And it's something that our Congress does quite well. It's very transparent, it's very open. And I think more importantly, I always try to take this opportunity to say that it is not an I got you committee. It is one that tries to keep you out of trouble, not get you in trouble. I think that's a very important clarification to make. And that includes staff. And then finally, gender mainstreaming. It's something that we've seen more and more of. Gender mainstreaming in Parliament. Again, not just increasing numbers, because to be honest, that doesn't really matter. What matters is to have quality, excellent diversity within the Parliament that can properly represent the voices of the constituency. The only numbers I'll provide, I was told not to provide too many numbers, but I would say that in the last Congress, in the 116th Congress, so 2 years, we worked with just over 1,000 staff and MPs. And what I really love about it is that it's a split straight down the middle. Just over 500 MPs and just under 500 staff. And within those 500 groups, about half and half women and men. And so we're really proud of that. Parliament working with staff is, in my mind, just as important as working with members. Staff serve as the conduit. They serve as the body of knowledge when members come in and out as they get elected and lose elections. And so working with staff, and in many parliaments, they're the ones that really do a lot of the legwork. I can speak from experience. It's essential that we work with staff to ensure that they can support their bosses effectively. Okay, so to close, because I know we're short on time, the pros. This is obvious. MPs, members of Congress, and members of Parliament are champions. They're champions of what they do. No one can speak as authoritatively as a member can. You can be an expert, you can read books, you can have experience in the field, but if you haven't, run and served your constituency, you are not a member. And that's what other members, that's what other parliaments really want to hear from. They want to hear from their counterparts. And so we provide that. MPs also have a lot of cachet. They are often important figures. They have important jobs. They are policy experts. And so working with members and senior staff and regular staff is essential. The world is flat, and congressional diplomacy, if I may, is something that is essential nowadays. So exposing not only our members to the world and what happens in country X and Y matters for the United States, and it matters for Canada. And our members need to be made aware of that. And that's sometimes not always very obvious. And then I would say another pro is the politics. Coming from the Congress, we can bridge political divide. We can manage a discourse. We work in a very bipartisan nature. That is one of our core tenets. If we did not do so, we would lose all credibility. And so coming in a bipartisan fashion to another multi-party or multi-partisan group or demographic, it helps bridge those divides almost immediately. Now, the con of some of the work or some of the challenges that we have are the politics. Countries don't always want to work in a multi-party and multi-partisan fashion, and that's fine. We understand that. We need to be creative about how we engage with different parties when we talk about the issues that we talk about. And I would also say it's difficult domestically. We know the US is quite partisan right now, especially in recent months. And so it's difficult to put everything aside, to compartmentalize what divides us internally in the United States, and then go out and speak to our counterparts around the world in a bipartisan and nonpartisan fashion, because this we can agree on. This is what our members, our 20 members of Congress that serve in our commission, unequivocally agree that this work is important. And so they can put aside their differences and focus on this. And that is hugely important in this work. And then, I'll leave it there. We have some great reports that we've recently done. We have some great examples of how we've been able to work and evolve through COVID, but I will leave that for the Q&A and for anyone else to discuss as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek. And I think that leads us then into a wonderful segue to Kristen, because I think your work at NDI, you'll demonstrate how it really follows on to some of this work that's being done through HDP. So Kristen, could you please give us your intro?
Absolutely. I hope you can all hear me. I'm having all sorts of technical fun challenges today. But I want to start off by thanking the Parliamentary Center for this invitation. I'm really honored to be included in this panel, and already it's such an engaging discussion. I'm really excited to be part of it. I would just start out with a little bit of backdrop, recognizing that these are challenging times, of course, for democratic development around the world. It's well documented. VDEM has put out some recent reports, for instance, that show that 2/3 of the world is now living under autocratic rule. And in many countries, what that means is that executive power is expanding at the expense of legislatures and checks and balances and horizontal accountability more broadly. So if we take that as a backdrop, I guess I would just focus my few minutes of remarks on the why. Why do legislatures matter for democracy and development? And also the how a little bit in terms of what are some implications for how legislative assistance should be designed. First, just in terms of the why, and I know that it's self-evident, but I think it bears repeating that obviously legislators matter for democracy. Again, if we take another research stream that VDEM's done of looking at 120 years of cases where the evidence shows that greater legislative and judicial constraints on the executive are associated with a decreased probability of democratic erosion or democratic regression. I mean, to turn that on its head, it makes sense that it's hard to imagine a healthy, vibrant democracy that doesn't have an effective, responsive, independent legislature. And then the second point, and this gets to what John, I think, was referring to on the policy side, which it's not just that legislatures matter for democracy, but also for development. And really any issue that you look at, any of the pressing global challenges we have, from COVID recovery to climate policy making and everything in between, legislatures have a critical role to play in representing their constituents, making policy, conducting oversight. Just to take one example, I know Derek referred to this as well, but gender equality, which of course is a cornerstone of Canada's foreign assistance, and where we've seen in a number of cases that legislative assistance can make a difference, not just in terms of increasing the number of women represented, but also in terms of different policy outcomes or making their participation more viable, and supporting their right to effectively exercise office. For instance, in Peru, where NDI and others supported research, deliberations with civil society and MPs to facilitate passage of legislation aimed at reducing violence against women in politics, again, so that women have the space and can exercise their right to participate free of that threat of violence. Another example I already referred to it is the COVID recovery. I mean, in NDI, we believe that the only path to a sustainable COVID recovery is if we build back democratically, meaning through democratic engagement. And there's no building back democratically without legislatures. So Derek alluded to this, but through HDP, we've put out a couple of reports on parliaments and their role in pandemic policymaking, particularly as it relates to the economic recovery. And Kevin knows well about these reports since he's the co-author of both of them, but really trying to build on that peer-to-peer exchange and those practical lessons from our HDP partners in other countries in terms of how parliaments can more effectively engage in that building back in a sustainable and inclusive way. One of the issues within the COVID recovery that we think is quite critical, for instance, is the question of public debt management. Just to give a particular example, where we have, half of low-income countries are either in debt distress or at high risk, and that reduces their fiscal space. It reduces kind of their economic recovery prospects. And legislatures have often been sidelined from debt discussions, debt decision-making, and had limited oversight when it comes to debt questions. So again, through HDP, we've supported peer-to-peer exchanges on legislative oversight, including on debt, so that against this global shared challenge, legislatures can come together and talk about some of the information gaps, the data gaps, and the capacity challenges and the political challenges around effectively exercising oversight and engagement on debt. Another example there too, I think, is leveraging the Open Government Partnership, where Canada has been such an important member country and was, I think, until quite recently, in fact, the co-chair of OGP, working with parliaments in an open parliament platform to support debt transparency and hopefully do away once and for all with that very insidious phenomenon that we have currently of hidden debt. So it's just a couple of examples on the why. And then in the 2 minutes maybe that I have remaining, I would just maybe talk about a couple of hows. And some of this has already been referred to by the others, but I think first of all, it's the issue of timing. It's important to work with parliaments now to get out in front of the risks of erosion. Legislative constraints on the executive make the onset of erosion less likely, but once that regression begins, it may be too late to build those relationships and to start working with legislatures. It's important to get out in front, to get ahead of the curve, even in countries where legislatures might seem to work, to have a strategic long-term vision and relationship and assistance program so that we're really helping to buttress parliaments as an effective space for resilience to any future threat of authoritarian slide. I think I'll share one bit of good news, and that is that legislative assistance doesn't have to be expensive. We're not talking about building the parliamentary house or necessarily big IT investments or all sorts of different infrastructure things, but rather it's having that strategic vision, the flexibility to respond to opportunities, building those relationships, being politically informed. Often that's best done in a low profile, more inexpensive sort of fashion. So again, it doesn't have to be a huge, big ticket item, but it can have a big payout in terms of those policy outcomes that one might seek. And then just the last little bit is that, I mean, I understand that for donors, for multilaterals, for other international organizations, there's a little hesitance about working with legislatures, because I think as others have said, as John said, working with legislatures is political, but not working with legislatures is also political, in the sense that when international actors decide to concentrate their engagement and their support in the executive, for instance, with ministries, because it's quicker or more technical, that also has an impact. It has a political impact on legislatures and the broader democratic context. So it's not a new lesson, of course, but it's more apparent. I think it's more urgent since the pandemic, and in this context that we have of authoritarian ascendance. So I guess my last sort of word would be that looking at ways to engage the legislatures, not to bypass them, so that we don't risk further exacerbating that imbalance that we're seeing between the executive and the legislature. So, but with that, I'll jump off my soapbox. Thank you all for the attention, and hand it back to the moderator.
Thank you, Kristen. And before I pass it to Tom, I just have to say, because, you know, Parlamerica's, we do work with the parliaments throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. And I'm going to just have to plug it right here, though, that NDI is such a valued partner for our work there. We really do find great success in the collaborations we have, NDI. And NDI is the one that introduced us to HDP. And so those collaborations with HDP really came from NDI. NDI got us into Open Parliament Partnership, or like the Open Government Partnership. And so really, the leadership that you're showing in this hemisphere is tremendous, as well as globally. Tom, I would like you to round out the end of our introduction sessions, kind of the initial points. Can you please take the floor?
Sure, let me unmute myself before I start talking, as opposed to what I usually do, which is start talking and then unmute myself. Let me thank you all for the introduction. For the many wise comments that have been made by those who've come before me, and as the wrap-up speaker, I will try not to repeat too much of what has been said before, and I'll try to wrap things up and put things in a little bit of a structure. But I need to start by really emphasizing that what I'm going to say is really not official U.S. government or USAID opinion, that these are my personal perspectives rather than the views of the U.S. government. However, they are based on some of the work that you or somebody else had mentioned about the, kind of an overview of legislative strengthening, and some of you, we've talked about some of these issues before. So I want to start by saying that while these are not official perspectives, it is clearly U.S. government policy that democracy matters. And that is something that President Biden speaks about frequently. If you haven't seen it or read it, I was really struck by a short speech that President Biden gave at a memorial service for a former U.S. Senator a couple of weeks ago. He talked about a really personal vision of democracy. He says, democracy is the very soul of our nation. He says, democracy is more than a form of government. Democracy is a way of being, which really struck me. I've heard a lot of politicians and elected officials talk about democracy in various ways and talk about different aspects of it in different contexts. I've never really heard it quite so personal and passionate, and that really struck me. And I've also been struck by how openly he talks about the challenges to democracy that we face very much at home, as everyone knows, and also abroad, and how that then drives discussion of a policy to address those challenges, to respond to those challenges. And so I wanted to kind of put my remarks in that context, the notion that we have to think from my position and from the agency position, we have to think about how do we work with legislatures in a way which contributes to these larger objectives of promoting democracy, resisting the challenges to democracy. So I'll just run through what I see as the objectives. I'll talk about the 5 broad objectives, and then a couple of kind of the inputs to those objectives. And to some extent, this restates what has come before, but I think it provides a kind of a more of a framework for thinking about these things. So in thinking about the outcomes and objectives of legislatures, I think you have to start with the importance of Parliament as the institutional foundation for democratic government. You can't have a democracy without division of government. You can't have a democracy in which there is all of the functions and powers are vested in the executive rather than divided between the executive, legislature, and judiciary. And all of the alternatives to democracy, the autocracy, the tyranny, the dictatorship, managed democracy, all these things, whatever you call them, these are defined by a monopoly on government power concentrated in the executive branch. So I suppose that in theory, it's possible to have a dictatorship in which the parliament or judiciary are dominant institutions, but that's not really what we encounter in the real world. But what we do encounter is sort of a political science challenge, question, theoretical question, is whether this function that parliaments are expected to play of constraining the executive, whether that function can come from outside government altogether, right? You know, what we call diagonal accountability. Can it come from an empowered civil society and empowered media? Is that sufficient for constraining the power of the executive? And something we can talk about later. So I think it's a real debate that is taking place both theoretically and practically. Democracy by itself is not enough. You can't eat an election. So another thing that we frequently hear from President Biden is the need to really demonstrate that democracy delivers, right? That the democratic government provides for the needs and aspirations of its citizens. I recently put together a whole set of kind of like the evidence for democracy and used, there's a very good body of work by the VDEM Institute on the case for democracy. Contributing to that is the question of how an effective legislature contributes to those outcomes, to the equitable, steady economic growth above all as a policy outcome, but also to the sectoral outcomes, health, education, environmental protection. The third function is the accountability function. These are really the historical roots of the parliament, right? This is what a parliament was supposed to have done in the 17th and 18th century, the power of the purse, how the state raises money and how it spends money. I'm really happy to hear Kristen talking about the debt function of the parliament. It's something that I think that we're going to have to look at more. In general, I think that there has been a fair amount of attention to sort of the spending side of the budget, the expenditure side. I think we need to start paying more attention to the revenue side, not just on the debt side, but also on domestic resource mobilization, the taxation side. Ultimately, taxes really matter a lot. And this connects very much to the fight against corruption, which is really one of the top 2 or 3 program priorities that has been coming out of this administration. And if you haven't read it, I'd really urge you to take a look at the National Security Study Memorandum on Corruption, which came out in early June. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Legislatures are the source of diversity, representation, and inclusion in government, right? Krista and others talked about representation of women, but we really need to think about them not just in gender terms, but other entry points, youth in particular, ethnic minorities. Legislatures are the ladder by which people move from being citizens to being representatives to being government officials, elected officials. And finally, and this is something we heard about particularly from Derek and Alicia, is legislatures in bilateral and multilateral diplomacy, right? When we talk about, from our perspective, why should a USAID mission or a Canadian diplomatic mission, why are legislative programs and engagement with the legislature important? We realize that countries just build stronger relationships when those relationships are not just channeled through the executive branch, but when we have these ties between elected officials, when our embassy staff, USAID personnel are reaching out and hearing from members of parliament what their concerns are, what's going on in their districts, how they're interacting with civil society, with ministries, other branches of government, that is a healthier, more complex relationship. So that's 5 functions, democracy, development, accountability, diversity, diplomacy. If somebody can figure out a way to say accountability in a way that starts with the letter D, that would really make my mnemonic devices a lot better. But the accountability isn't a word. So, if those are the functions, then I guess we can ask, right? Like, are they actually doing that, right? Are our legislatures doing that? Not just in the developing world, the ones that we work with, but the ones, in our countries, in the developing countries, are they fulfilling those functions? I don't get to work on our own legislature, but thinking about ones our partners, to what extent are they making these contributions? To what extent are they doing the things that we expect that they should do? And I don't want to get into the various ins and outs of different kinds of ways of measuring legislatures' capacity. But I think that most people that work with legislatures think that the answer is mostly no. They're not really doing that. They're not living up to those expectations. I think that the people who don't work with legislatures would be even more emphatic in saying, no, they're not. There may be some legislatures that are doing better than others in different ways, and there's certainly sort of bright spots in individual cases, but overall, I think that the picture for legislatures is not very encouraging, and I think it's not coincidental that that goes along with the overall democratic decline. There's a kind of a poli-sci debate about, what are the drivers, but they clearly go together. So that makes us ask, why? Like, why aren't they contributing these roles? Why aren't they doing those functions? And just before I answer that, let me just go on and talk about that. Why? What is holding legislatures back? Why are they so chaotic, so paralyzed, so rowdy, so passive, so corrupt? All these things. Why are they such a pain in the ass? Right? Like what is the problem here? And as tempting as that question is to ask, I think it's kind of the wrong question, right? Because what we should ask instead is not why are legislatures so weak? We should turn it on its head and say, look, there is an imbalance of power between the legislative and executive branches. That imbalance has an effect on the ability of the country to accomplish its political, economic, and social objectives. And the question is, why is the executive branch so strong? What enables the executive branch to maintain this monopoly on power that then suppresses the ability of the legislature to contribute to these political and economic objectives? Because ultimately, this is not supposed to be a zero-sum game, right? Where you have power shifting between the legislative and the executive. I'm leaving the judiciary aside. I apologize to my rule of law colleagues, but for simplicity, talk about these two branches. We need this situation where these two branches are supporting each other, where they're effectively independent, but have that functional parity so that they're making each other stronger, that both institutions are getting stronger together, right? So this question of how does the executive suppress the legislative is one that, is a little bit less political, actually, in some ways, right? Because that's something that's we can look at a little bit more objectively. There's a little bit more distance from the partisan politics, personalities of a particular place. And so I'll lay out the three sort of factors, the three inputs, right? If those are, I have 5 outputs, 5 objectives, these are going to be 3 inputs. And the first set of inputs, it's kind of the structural inputs, right? It's, what is the constitutional structure that determines the balance of power between executive and legislative branches? But here's what's really interesting is that there's this common assumption that it's the form of government that determines how strong a parliament is. But it turns out that, the constitutional design is a parliamentary system, a presidential system, a hybrid, whatever. But it turns out that isn't as important as you really think, because you can have a relatively strong and effective parliament in a presidential system. You can have a very weak and ineffective parliament in a parliamentary system. It matters that, the extremes where you have these autocratic presidential structures, but for the most part, that's not what's determinative. What is determinative in sort of the structural sense is more specific functions and powers that a parliament has. For example, if you look at the VDEM indicators on legislative capacity, one of the ones that's really important is the power to investigate the executive in practice, not just in theory, but in practice, right? If you look at some of the work that's been done by these guys, like these people going back even to the structure of the English Parliament, the power of what's called budgetary reversion, right, which is the power of the Parliament to, what does the executive branch have to do in order to revise its budget in the middle of a budget year? It turns out to be really important to the long-term, power of the Parliament, right, so that you don't end up with what we have, like continuing resolutions and stuff. Anyways. So that, like the structural powers are important. The second set of inputs is capacity. That's the human institutional capacity rules research. I think we've pretty much gotten good at understanding that over the years. I won't talk about that. But the third thing, which is really critical ultimately, is this political independence, right? Which is this ability of the parliament legislature to take actions independent of the executive. I don't like the word political will, because I think it's just become so widely used, it doesn't really mean anything. And also because when you talk about political will, it forces you to think about what the intent of a particular action is. What are the motivations of particular actors, which is really hard to discern, right? You're making some assumptions that you can't do. Yeah, Kevin? And so I think it's just like, it's the political independence. So So I know that anything with the word political makes development professionals nervous. So it's helpful to look at this from that technical, dispassionate perspective. And so, how do executives constrain legislative independence? There are these things like limiting the resources, the functions of parliament. You see the control over who gets on the ballot, right? Whether it's through a primary process or through the parliamentary list. There's the ability to maintain short-term high turnover in the parliament so that you can't develop an independent political base. You control the money needed for elections. You control those politically attractive benefits. You control the engagement with other civic institutions and with the media. So, that I think is the sort of like the three categories of inputs. So to wrap it up, that's the five functions that we think about, three inputs that we think about. And I think that this is sort of emerging for us. And again, this is really like the beginning of these ideas, and this thinking is beginning to emerge for us as kind of like a way of thinking about, how to organize legislative strengthening programs rather than organizing them around what's traditionally been, like these functions, the legislative function, the oversight function, the representation function. That's really not what parliaments do, right? That doesn't really mean anything anymore, really. So we need to think about it in a new framework, and this is kind of one of the ways of thinking about it. And just to conclude on this, like going back to the Summit for Democracy, overall democracy policy, a big element of that summit, the policy as a whole, is that this isn't something that we can do on our own, right? This isn't a U.S. task. We aren't able to engage. We don't work as well if we don't work together, and it's a struggle that needs to be engaged on a multitude of fronts: civil society, rule of law, elections, political parties, and what we're really hoping for, what I'm really hoping for, is that we'll see more engagement by Canada, which has so much to offer in this space, in this field of engagement with legislatures and legislative strengthening. So I'll just wrap it up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you to the other panelists as well. Very interesting perspectives. I think particularly, Tom, your point about unpacking some of that, some of the drivers or the challenges, and what we see as the sign of, the independence of parliaments as a critical form of that balance with the executive. So I thank you all for your inputs. We wanted to provide a few questions, Alicia and I, related to that we had a chance to sort of think about as other people working in the field, and then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. But just to also say, there is a Q&A function in the chat function, or separately from it. But I see some people have already posted questions, and John has been very good to even respond to one already. So please continue to do that as well. But let me just start with a question that I'll put out, I guess, to all of you. But if one of you want to volunteer to be the first, please just put up your hand. We see in international development a real focus on capacity building of civil society, their role in creating political demand or for advocacy towards policy change, whether that be in education or health or agriculture or widgets. And so there's been a tendency amongst development partners to focus on that side of the equation. And there's the other side of the equation, which sometimes in my work we'll call supply side, which is the parliament, increasing the capacity of parliament to be able to reach out and accept what civil society is advocating. And it's particularly in Canada, we have the Feminist International Assistance Policy, where there's been a lot of investment on the civil society side. So my question to you would be, how do we ensure that the supply side of political space for dialogue is also strengthened, and how does that relate to civil society? How do we bring civil society into the conversation in a way that doesn't see these two as mutually exclusive or as competitors for international assistance, but more in which it's a partnership and that there's a benefit to them working closer together? I don't know who wants to start with a response to that question, or John, go ahead.
One of the things that I've seen over the years, it's nice when you have worked in a legislature before and you understand what motivates people in the legislature, why they do what they do, what makes them desire to do things that they want to do. And I think one of the problems is when sometimes civil society people don't understand how to engage with people in a legislature. They come with their own perspective, like, this is important, we have to make this change, we need to do it now, damn it, and if you don't listen to me, you're just corrupt and you're all these other things. To help people understand what good lobbyists know, which is how to get into the head of a legislator, to see things from their perspective and to understand that we can help them accomplish their objectives by providing this information that will help them accomplish their jobs. That kind of thinking is really critical. So I think there's a great need to help civil society learn to engage with legislatures. Partly this can be done through programs which bring them both together, but I think that's one of the fundamental pieces.
Yeah, and let me just jump in on that. Sorry, Kristen. And I don't want to overstate that that civil society needs to be wholly responsive to members of parliament. Certainly not. That being said, a lot of civil society's work around the world, it's more of like an I got you, sort of similar to the example I use it with the ethics committee. You're corrupt, or you're not showing enough, or you're not doing enough. I think they rarely lift up really good MPs or really good offices. And I think to show that it is a relationship, because in the United States, we see civil society as, invaluable partners. They are surrogates for our policies because we represent what they need and they help amplify the support that we have or the fact that we support those messages. So the relationships are there. But it's making sure that they're leveraged appropriately and that they're able to work in a more productive manner. So certainly, yes.
Thank you. Kristen, you had something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what others have said. I guess that maybe in line with what Derek was saying, I think it's happening in a lot of places, but we do need to move past that gotcha, that watchdog approach and expand it. And again, legislatures are having so many challenges. I've often said not less watchdog and more EKG. It's almost like civil society should be doing parliamentary monitoring, but also kind of looking for taking the pulse and monitoring the health of the parliament as a body, and also advocating for the parliament vis-a-vis the types of executive aggrandizement that Tom Bridle was talking about. So I do think that it calls for a different kind of monitoring, a more nuanced monitoring and a more systemic monitoring. And then I also think that there are a lot of issues where, again, parliaments are at a disadvantage sometimes vis-a-vis the executive, or there's common interests. For instance, I mentioned the debt issue. There's a lot of opportunity here for civil society. There's so much interesting debt advocacy with Jubilee movements and such, but they rarely engage with parliaments. And so I think that that's an opportunity. I think on the gender issue that you referenced, that some of the most successful advances that we've seen in terms of gender legislation, gender equality, has been because there's been an alliance between, say, a women's caucus in a parliament with the women's movements who are so powerful. When there's a divorce, I think, between the women politicians and the women's organizations, we see stagnation, we see less progress. So I do think that elevating some of those success stories around specific desired policy outcomes can maybe be a powerful incentive and motivator.
Okay, thank you. Tom, do you have anything to add, or are you okay if we go on to the next question? Yeah, okay, thank you. Alicia?
Thank you. Look, I mean, this next question is closer to my heart. Canada has shown leadership in the use of parliamentary diplomacy. I mean, Canada did spearhead the creation of Parl-Americas 20 years ago. It's our 20th anniversary. But this is only in a limited geographical space. And so I'm delighted in the last 10 years, we've really upped the amount of work we've been able to do in the region. We only hit one part of the world. And we hear a lot about peer-to-peer and how important this peer-to-peer is. Derek, you already spoke to this, but I'd really be interested to hear from your perspectives. I mean, where is there more space out there for Canada? Should Canada be engaging more actively in this peer-to-peer parliamentary strengthening of MPs, parliamentary staff? What do you perceive to be Canada's value added in this space? Where are there opportunities for an HDP-like initiative in Canada?
Well, if I may firstly respond, the answer to that is an emphatic yes, 100%. There's no competition when it comes to this type of thing. We're stronger, someone said it, when we're united. There is 100% a very important role that Canada can, but more importantly, should play in this field. Canada is a first tier, very strong and stable democracy with excellent processes and excellent accountability and really great lessons to impart. It's also a global leader and I think would certainly value the opportunity to learn from other partners and legislatures around the world. Arguably, I would say Canada is better suited to work with a lot of the countries around the world because you share the Westminster tradition that the United States does not, which automatically makes you far more relevant when it comes to certain processes and procedures, or just generally, the way perhaps the institution thinks. And so that is a huge opportunity there. And of course, I think it was John who mentioned French. You have almost an entire population that speaks fluent French, of which many countries around the world also at least refer to as a business language or a more formal language. So in addition to a native tongue. So yes, excellent opportunities. And just think what better or how more efficient could we be if we had a strong 1-2 American-Canadian punch when it comes to programs such as like we're having right now, if we have Canadian and American MPs, Canadian and American staff working jointly in person or over virtual with their counterparts abroad. It would just make everything far more effective, in my humble opinion.
Thank you. Yes, please, John. Oh, you're muted.
One practical, easy step. The program at McGill regularly has, at least pre-COVID, was regularly having parliamentarians and staff in town, and now they're doing it virtually. But I think if you could find a way to connect and link with what you're doing to try to encourage that kind of relationship, you'd have an audience already in town that they love Canada, and there's going to be interest in it. So I think that's a practical, easy first step that could get you started too.
Kristen, yep, please.
Yeah, I think, as I was alluding to before, this is kind of an all hands on deck moment. I think that Canadian support in particular would be welcome, again, to push back against the rising wave that we're seeing of authoritarianism, against populism, against polarization. On all three of those counts, I think Canada has a very strong record and experiences to be able to share with others. I think that the work that Parliamericus has done, as you said, it's just in one corner of the world, but a very important and pivotal corner of the world, and the types of parliamentary exchanges, peer-to-peer exchanges that Parliamericus has been able to work on and to assist in terms of raising, issues of common concern, again, like the gender one, like disinformation, like the pandemic response, just gives us kind of a glimmer or a window into what could be done on a broader, more global context. And especially given Canada's, such a strong record on human rights issues and inclusion issues and the democracy delivery agenda that we're all talking about, I think that there would be certainly a lot to share. And I think what's been so useful too from the HDP perspective that Derek laid out is just that working across the aisle and showing legislatures, even in the US, we're living some very polarized times, but HDP is a space where people are working together across the aisle, and to be able to show those positive experiences to other countries, I think is very, very rewarding, and it really speaks to resilience even in challenging times, such as what we've been going through here in the US with lots of different democracy deficits.
Thank you. Tom, I'm just checking. Are you good? Or would you like to say something?
I'm good. Everything that I couldn't agree more with everything that everybody said. Like those kinds of peer-to-peer exchanges are incredibly valuable. It seems to me that, there's something weirdly magical that happens to people when they get elected to office, that they suddenly something changes in their brain, that they suddenly believe that their IQ has doubled, and that they know the answers to all the questions, and that they recognize other people who have that same quality. Like there's really a peer-to-peer quality to that staff to member does not have, or expert to member does not have. So that there's a real value to those kinds of exchanges and those discussions.
Before I go on to the next question, I'll just pick up on that and say I agree 100%. When I walk in a room doing the work I do, if I say that I was elected for 9 years, they will often ask me, how much were you elected? Once, twice, 3 times? Because they want to sort of measure you But once you say you've been elected 4 times and we're in for 9 years, it changes the conversation completely. So I agree with you on that, Tom. But let's go on to another question. You know, obviously the international community, the development partners are very keen on achieving the Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think we learned from the MDGs, the lessons learned from that process is that that you're not going to achieve them unless you have the political will and the momentum at political level to make the decisions with regard to new legislation or even budget allocation and policy. And that revolves around Parliament and the government and governance. So I guess the question is, how do we, you know, not only talk about legislative strengthening for the sake of legislative strengthening, and I know you've all touched on that to some extent, the broader engagement, but when we're actually talking about international development partners who are clearly very focused on SDG achievement, what is the added value of working with parliaments, working with legislatures in order to actually deliver on the SDGs? Who wants to start with that one? Not all at once, please.
I mean, I was gonna say, I talked about this a little bit. I mean, you just don't get the development results, particularly around economic development, unless you have that sort of you begin to have some of those discussions around policy and that process where these two institutions, these two branches of government are mutually reinforcing as opposed to either blurred into one body or, you know, at paralyzing odds with each other. You know, that there is a synergy that happens, right? That accomplishes these objectives. I think that some of the development partners, I mean, I don't know if you're talking about sort of the World Banks, the IMFs, the UNDPs of the world, right? I think that there's some recognition of that. I think that the bigger challenge is that I think that there's that we need to talk about that fundamental. We need to talk about this in concrete terms in some ways. You know, like in country X, the legislature, you know, this legislative committee can contribute to this outcome, and find the ways that happens in each individual country. And I think that members need to do that, and civil society can also contribute to that.
Yes, John.
A quick addition. We have to think in terms of incentives. People do what they do for reasons. If parliamentarians don't see any benefit in pursuing these MDGs, what's it going to do for me in the bottom line? Am I going to have a better name for myself? Will I get reelected? You know, what's in it for me? And one of the things that could be in it for them, for donors to be thinking about, is on these really critical key issues, how do we engage them and think about what's important to them? Meetings like with HDP, if HDP is in town and we really want to talk about, I don't know if they can want to talk about this, but we really want to talk about climate change, or we really want to talk about these particular issues. Who's interested? Who knows something about this? Get ways to start to facilitate their interest, to provide incentives. So that's one piece. And then, but I think we really have got to think about what do they want. They're not going to do it because they're supposed to.
Okay, thank you. So, Alicia?
Well, I saw Kristen just raise her finger, so if she does want to say something, and then I think we're moving to public Q&A. Kristen,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I agree with what others have said, and the incentive question is particularly important at the country level. But I did want to, you know, refer to kind of what I was saying earlier too, from the international, the global perspective. I mean, if we just look at COVID, and we've talked about building back democratically, but there's a lot of panels out there already and lessons learned reports on the pandemic and how to prepare, God forbid, for the next one, or climate crises. And I'm already seeing that there's this huge focus on only technical solutions, like better surveillance, for instance. And all of the technical solutions are important, but I'm still afraid that we're not, as an international community, learning the lesson from the current pandemic and really committing that for future crises, shoring up preparedness aspects in ways that are consistent with democratic principles and legislative engagement. So almost like a pledge to do no democratic harm should be coming into the preparedness, the disaster risk reduction that people are talking about when it comes to climate change, future pandemics and such, and certainly working on those with legislatures, working on those adaptations with legislatures so that they're not, again, caught on their back foot. And again, I think that Derek already put in a plug in the chat for the new resources that have come out that Kevin co-authored, but I think that there's a lot of good lessons in there in terms of, again, those preparedness factors for shoring up legislative resilience in the future.
Thank you, Kristen.
Look, Alicia, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I would love to pick your brain so much more. And if we could do this for hours and hours, that would be great. But I see lots of questions in the Q&A. And so I really do think we have to let these other attendees pick your brains as well. And so I'm going to pass it to Gabrielle because you were possibly the one to help us through this.
Oh my goodness, what a task indeed. And hard to live up to your exceptional moderation skills along with Kevin just now. So we do have a lot of questions in the chat. We're going to try to cover as many as we are able to. I'd just like to let our audience know that our panel is shifting now. This is a dialogue between American and Canadians, and we have the fortune of having two outstanding Canadian experts with us here today. So Alicia and Kevin will be also available to answer questions alongside of the American counterparts. We hope that you will both step up and respond to the questions as they're appropriate. And given the shortage of time, I'm going to be taking questions in the order that people have upvoted them. This is a democracy, and that's thanks to Zoom. I guess we can use it. So please do use the upvote function if you'd like to see a question prioritized. So we'll be starting with a question from Innocent from Cape Town in South Africa. He writes, COVID-19 saw the rise of executive dominance and the sidelining of parliaments in the developing world. There is a fear that parliaments will not be able to regain lost ground and that executive dominance is here to stay. How can parliaments go about reclaiming their constitutional oversight role? Thank you, Innocent. Do we have volunteers for this one? Who would like to respond? John.
Always ready to jump in, hopefully something useful to say. I think one of the reasons for the executive dominance many times is because the partnership between the executive and the party, the ruling party, is so strong that the price is really high of actually challenging the government and of actually performing your oversight. In worst case scenarios, you could get yourself killed. In much lesser severity, you can marginalize yourself. It's going to take some courageous leaders in parliaments that would be willing to stand up for saying, you know what, this institution is important. And I think they need to get pressure from the outside. And we talked about how they work with groups outside of the parliament. If some of these, again, this is really hard, but if some of these linkages could be made and support could be built by people and organizations realizing that we really need to have parliament do something, and we'll really try to help those that do participate. That's one little bit, but I think we've got to understand there's structural factors that make it so difficult to respond appropriately.
Thanks. Tom B.
So I think that a lot of this ultimately comes down to the ability of the executive to suppress the independence of the parliament. And so what I would focus on primarily, above all, is ways to reduce the influence of the executive on who gets into the parliament, right? So, whether that's in terms of shaping who's on parliamentary lists or shaping who wins primary elections, and you see, particularly in Africa, you see, countries that are not parliamentary list countries, where the primaries are either not contested or not observed by either domestic or international election observers. So there's a very high degree of fraud and manipulation in those elections. I think you have to really start with that ability of the executive to determine who's in the parliament, because if you can pick who your parliament is going to be, you're essentially determining what they're going to say. You have to have an independent parliament in order for all of the other things that that we expect parliaments to do to happen. So I think that's something that international observers and international donors can do in terms of their democracy portfolios in general, and it's something that domestic civil society organizations can focus on as well, just breaking this power of the executive over the legislative.
One of the, sorry, Kevin, one of the hardest things I've seen as well is when a party does really well and they have the presidency and they have the executive and the legislature and they've got widespread support, then conducting oversight on their peers or on their same party is not something that they want to do. They don't want to bring negative attention to anything, and so they refrain from doing so. So I think that alone right there, making sure that those parliamentarians, of the MPs, realize that they are beholden to the people and not to the party boss, whether that's the president or the speaker or the secretary general of the parliament. And that's something that we all collectively do and throughout our work, but making sure that they realize that they answer to the people, not to the party. That's what the MP does. They might suffer some consequences. We see it happen in the United States as well. But as long as they're beholden to their constituencies, then over time, that's when they can reclaim that mantle of accountability and oversight.
Can I throw just one more thing on that, just quickly? I think that there's a need, and Derek just alluded to this, to make politics local again, right? And it's true in the U.S. as well as every place as it is, in the developing world, that this process of making people accountable to their constituency, that's not a natural thing. That's not something that comes necessarily from the courage of the individual MP. That requires some sort of structural and broader political changes that we have to be a part of and support. It's not just the courage of an individual member of parliament.
Can I just say, but just very, very quick, because I know we have to get to time, is that peer-to-peer though, and Derek probably has seen it, but we see it in our work all the time. Half of it is the parliamentarians themselves don't realize that they can demand more autonomy or ought to be asking for more autonomy as an institution. If they come from a tradition where the executive has been so strong vis-a-vis the parliament for such a long time, and they've entered politics that way, they just don't even recognize it. And we're seeing in a lot of these weaker parliaments where they're starting to go, really? I mean, the open parliament work we do, right, with Kristen, they're going, we ought to be asking for better, and they are starting to ask for better, right? They're starting to stand up to the executive to say, wait a second, the Constitution says we should have greater autonomy. Why don't we? So it's even just raising awareness in parliaments. I think we've slid so far to executive strength that a lot of the parliaments forgot that they're supposed to be asking or asserting their independence from the executive.
And their power of the purse, which I think for our system, certainly that is the most important example of, and I'm sorry, Kevin, all of us have interrupted you 5 times. Power of the purse, it's something I feel so strongly about and something we see in so many places. We're like, well, no, we do what the executive says. It's like, no, you don't. You have that power, you need to flex that muscle. We all know that if you don't flex a muscle, it withers. And so that's something so important in all of our work, is the power of the purse. It's one of the most important tools and levers of oversight that exist. Sorry.
Maybe I'll just quickly say I'm a person that always sort of sees the glass as half full. In the last week alone, so in a sense, I don't disagree with the question that at the beginning of the pandemic, particularly, I think executives very much there was demand for them to take action, and the parliament was left on was on its back of its foot at the time. But let me just give you 3 examples from the last week where I see that pushback. Malaysia, where they've tried to shut down the parliament for the last 6 months. And now the king has demanded, and the executive and the parliament have, and from opposition pressure, they've agreed to reinstate the parliament. Nepal, where the constitutional court just removed the prime minister and after trying to dissolve parliament and said parliament will come back. And Edison, I will just also say South Africa, your own country, where I know it's not exactly related to parliament, but you also, and I'm sorry to hear what's happening there right now, but you had a constitutional court that said no person is above the law. And so I think you're seeing the checks and balances working. I think the system was a bit creaky at the beginning of the pandemic, but I'm an optimist that things are starting to become more balanced.
Can I just add something, Gabrielle, as well? I agree with what others have said. I think Innocent's question really gets at that issue of this balance question that Kevin was talking about as well. And we're focused on legislative assistance, but of course, sometimes this regaining ground loss, it takes a long time, and it's not just limited to work within the legislature. So it could require more party building work, for instance, with opposition parties, because the degree of independence would also depend on the degree of strength of opposition parties. It might require some anti-corruption and some election work in terms of monitoring and pushing back on abusive state resources in elections. And then certainly all the types of civil society advocacy and incentives that can come from that sector, I think, are really important. So even though we're focused on the legislature, I think there's a lot of connections that when you're trying to help legislatures to regain lost ground or to simply be more stronger and independent and effective, we have to look at all of the different sorts of the broader democracy ecosystem, and it might require working on some of these other subsectors as well.
Fantastic, thank you. That was a wonderful question. There's sort of a lot of comments there. We have two questions that are cousins of each other that I'll group together. The first coming from Bob Miller. Thank you for being with us today. Very brief and to the point. How has the crisis in US democracy changed the landscape for international democracy assistance? Absolutely. A second question from Jeff Dubrow is in a similar vein. He mentions that John started off by talking about the good old days in parliamentary development, the third democratic wave of the 90s. Unfortunately, there is a consensus that we are now in a period of democratic retrenchment. It'll be interesting to discuss how the needs of parliamentary strengthening have changed in an era when authoritarianism is on the rise. So pulling those two questions together, we'd like to hear from our group. Any takers? The US crisis and the general rise in authoritarianism. Thank you, John.
My last time in Vietnam, I was with a friend who worked with us on a project over there. And I said, how do you view China? How do you view the United States now? She said, I trust China more than the United States. And this is for a woman who's working on a US project. So I think it's really serious. And I think we have a lot of work to do. And so I think it has changed the environment. And let me see, what was the second one was? The second question?
General authoritarianism and the rise in the US crisis.
Yeah, it has. I think it certainly has changed. Those were the easy days back then. We were the only game in town. Democracy was on the rise, and now other models are out there that are doing some things pretty well, other than democratic models. So I think what it's done is and we've heard this as a cliche before, but democracy has to deliver. And we really have to help that association between parliament and groups and societies to help facilitate. They're getting something. They're seeing that parliament is listening. They're seeing that parliamentarians care. But it's more challenging than it used to be.
Thanks. Kevin?
Go ahead, Kevin.
Look, I'm going to speak very personally to this answer. Having worked in a number of countries as a Canadian, but never, other than my recent work with the Parliamentary Centre, never for a Canadian government or NGO. I think that this is the time when Canada needs to step up, that we see other countries that are seeing challenges to their institutions, to their democracy, that will impact on how people perceive those institutions and perceive, how democracy support will be done. But I think Canada has so much to offer. We've talked a bit about, the panelists have talked about that. And I really think that, we can't sit on the sidelines. We have to be able to say to ourselves, okay, we have something to offer. I think there's a tendency in Canada to sort of say, oh, us, what can we do? No, we have a lot to offer. We have a long history of democratic institutions, and it's time for us to start moving towards taking our seat at the table and being active participants in not only legislative strengthening, but many other parts of political governance. So I'll leave it at that.
Sure.
Wholeheartedly agree with Kevin on everything he said. I would also look at this from a slightly more optimistic lens. Many Congresses, many of people that we work with recognize that one administration does not a country make, that the stronger the foundation of democracy that you have that exists allows you to weather any administration, whether it's Obama or Trump or whoever it might be. because certainly people would disagree with both. So A, I would say that. B, I would also say that we have never experienced a dip in the desire and the longing for collaboration with United States Congress. The Congress remains a non-political institution, even though it is heavily political. I know that's an oxymoron, but that's what makes our work so great, and that's why legislative strengthening and legislative programs are so great, is because while they are political, they can also be seen as strictly institutional, which is, I think, a lot harder to do when you're obviously working with party building or with the executive, specifically with the government. So there are still opportunities, there are still great things to share, but to Kevin's point, we have to step up. So does the United States to that fact as well. It's incumbent on all of us to continue this great work. Again, from those lenses of nonpartisanship, bipartisanship, technical best practices, etc., and stay away from any specific policy, because then that just gets you out of your lane.
Thanks, Alicia.
Can I just say too, because Kristen spoke to it in her opening remarks, and I just want to this is more maybe to Jeff's question, is this idea though that there is also a real opportunity to invest in those countries where they have functioning democracies, right? Like let's be working with them and strengthen them and building those relationships before we see a retrenchment or backsliding. I think you get a much quicker, bigger bang for your buck right then and there. It's hard as you start seeing them be whittled down, right? So I think there's an opportunity to shore up the existing democracies, and Canada can play and ought to play. And that also means investing, like actually paying money, right? And not just having a bunch of Canadians working in American and international organizations.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're close on time. There's one question that I would really like to hear the speakers address, because it's very forward-looking. From Anna Miller, she asks, she's curious to hear the panel's views on what skills next generation and aspiring MPs need to have before they enter elected office. What will best position them to be the upholders of strong and vibrant legislatures that deliver? Thank you so much, Anna, for that question. It will probably be our send-off question. And we can hear from all of you if we'd like to be our send-off question in a couple of words. What are those key skills?
Public service. It's serving the greater good. That's harder to teach that, I think, because that has to come from within to go through the slings of campaigning and representing. But public service, without that, you will not be good at your job, and you will not represent your constituencies effectively.
Thank you.
I would say getting elected.
All right. John?
Yeah, I guess, and look at what they're doing. I mean, those which are doing these kind of public service things, which obviously have some of that in them and are doing it. That's important. That doesn't mean they don't change when they get into power, but it increases the likelihood that they might stay true to what they are.
Very true. Great. Alicia.
I guess I would say it's incumbent on us practitioners working in the field to find programming that helps bring more young people into it. Because I think through that exposure, even through that engagement as a young person with your parliamentarians, with politicians, you will have a better understanding of what public service is. You might want to join politics, because right now you were seeing this wave of young people thinking that feeling completely disenfranchised and not seeing politics as the conduit through which they would like to affect change. And I think through programming where you kind of build those relationships the same way we were saying with civil society to build relationships with parliaments, I think youth to build a relationship with parliamentarians to see it as a vocation is going to also help lead this next generation of great. And I would love to work with young people more. So we will do more at Parliamericas for sure. It is a part of our mandate now. Our board has said as much. And I know NDI is. So maybe Kristen, I don't know. You guys are doing a lot with youth.
Kristen.
Yeah, thanks for that segue. So, I mean, we do have a campaign now in India called Youth to Power, and it's very much focused on the types of things that Alicia was laying out. You know, it's not just that one young person on their own is going to change everything. So it's looking at how to change the broader system, much as we talk about women's participation in politics. It's those young people building alliances also with, you know, older, more established politicians, but then with other sorts of groups, and the communication skills. Communicating a vision, but also knowing how to listen and take on the needs and interest priorities of your constituents, and building those into kind of consistent feedback loops, I think would be sort of the shorthand advice I'd give.
If I can just maybe say, I would say something probably a little more esoteric: empathy for others in politics who may be from different parties. Opportunities to try and build relationships, I think, are critical. So empathy with others, but also a very practical skill: good listening. 80% of the people you will engage as a constituent, as an MP or as a congressman or what have you, is people just want their voice heard. And as long as you don't only think that Twitter and Facebook are the places that all those voices are being heard, and you try and expand that to actually listen to people and have more conversations, I think that's going to be a big difference in politics.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you for a fantastic event. I could also, like Alicia said, go on and on listening to this, but we are at the end of our time. So I'll hand it over to Tom C. for the send-off.
Thank you. As I anticipated, a fantastic discussion. So I want to thank my former colleagues and current colleagues for the rich discussion, for the questions we got from the audience as well. Sort of my spirit is rekindled that this is an important issue and we need to keep working on it. My 3 takeaways: parliaments matter oftentimes in ways we don't appreciate, whether it's better diplomacy, more coherent foreign policy, better development outcomes, and a better balance between the executive and the legislature. Canada needs to step up. We've been consistent on that, so has our parliament. And so have a lot of us Canadians that have been working in this field for a long time. Our Westminster traditions, our strong feminist international assistance policy, linguistic and cultural diversity, reputation as a good partner, focused on human rights. We're ready for the challenge, and I think we're ready to do more. There are opportunities for our parliament to be more active in this space. I think the House Democracy Partnership provides us, and having worked with that partnership in my previous jobs, it provides us with an excellent example. We're ready as a parliamentary center to be a partner in an arrangement like that, along with Parliamericas. Watch the space. Just closing, our next event, we'll take a little hiatus. We'll be on Wednesday, September 15th. You don't want to miss it. It is about foreign disinformation campaigns and cybersecurity, and it's going to touch on some really troubling and growingly effective tactics of foreign malign interference in democracy. So please watch your email for invitations and our social media feeds. We're launching a new strategic plan soon. We're growing, we're taking on new staff, and we have new programming on women's political voice in Africa coming up. We have a new initiative with legislators and diplomats, and new focus on political parties and youth. So please follow us on social media, watch the space, and help us be Canada's global leader for democracy. Thanks for your attendance today. Have a good week.
Can our panelists stay on for 1 second? We'll do a quick screenshot. Thank you all for being here. It was a great conversation.
Fantastic.
All right. 1, 2, and cheese. That's it. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic discussion.
Absolutely. All right. We'll be in touch.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you.
you. Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much. Bye-bye.